The 47 Ronin, eternal revenge, the sword drawn. The hours following the attack on the shogun's palace passed like a nightmare suspended between waking and dreaming, each moment stretching into an eternity of mortal anticipation. Asano Takumi no Kami remained confined in chambers that were simultaneously prison and sanctuary, awaiting a trial that everyone knew was a mere formality. Protocol demanded the appearance of justice, even when the verdict had already been etched in stone by the gods themselves. The room where he awaited his sentence was austere but dignified, with high-quality tatami mats and a small window overlooking a garden where cherry trees were beginning to blossom. It was a cruel irony that the beauty of spring should bloom just as his own life was about to be cut short, as if nature were reminding him of all he would lose through a single moment of righteous rage. Two guards stood constant vigil, veteran men whose faces betrayed genuine discomfort with their mission. It wasn't hatred they felt for the prisoner, but a deep unease stemming from the certainty that they were witnessing something fundamentally wrong. The punishment of an honorable man for reacting to trials that would have broken lesser warriors. During the long hours of confinement, Asano showed no signs of despair or regret. He sat in the lotus position, gazing out the window at the garden, his controlled breathing reflecting a serenity that transcended circumstances. He had found peace in the knowledge that he had acted according to principles he valued more than life itself, and this knowledge sustained him better than any hope of clemency. When the officers finally arrived to escort him to trial, Asano stood with the dignity of someone who had spent the last few hours not mourning the past, but preparing his soul for what was to come. His movements were fluid and controlled, every gesture speaking of a man who had made peace with his fate and now walked toward it without hesitation or fear. The hall where he would be judged was the same one where he had been humiliated by Kira just hours before, but now it seemed transformed into an arena where conflicting values would face each other through formal words and predetermined sentences. The farce of justice. The court that would judge Asano Takumi no Kami was composed of the most powerful men in the Tokugawa regime, figures whose authority emanated not only from political position, but from centuries of tradition that had crystallized into a hierarchy that was seen as a reflection of the cosmic order itself. Seated in elevated positions, their ceremonial robes created a visual barrier between judges and judge that spoke more eloquently than words about the power dynamics at play. At the head of the court stood Yanagisawa Yoshiyasu, the shogun's chief advisor, and a man whose influence had grown through decades of navigating the treacherous waters of court politics. His eyes, honed by the experience of countless intrigues, studied Asano with the coolness of someone who had learned to see men not as individuals, but as pawns in a larger game where personal feelings were luxuries effective leaders could not afford. "Asano Takumi no Kami," Yanagisawa said, his voice echoing through the hall with an authority that made even veteran samurai instinctively straighten their postures. "You are hereby charged with the gravest crime that can be committed against the sacred order, violence in our Lord's palace, desecrating the sacred ground with blood spilled in fury, disturbing the harmony that sustains our kingdom." The indictment was read with a legal precision that transformed human emotion into abstract categories of crime and punishment. There was no mention of the provocations that had led to the attack, no consideration of the weeks of systematic humiliation that had pushed an honorable man beyond the limits of human endurance. It was justice reduced to its coldest, most impersonal form, law enforcement without regard for context or morality. Asano listened silently, his erect posture and serene expression contrasting dramatically with the gravity of the charges. When he was finally given the opportunity to speak in his own defense, his words cut through the legal formality like a blade through silk. "Honored sirs," he said, bowing with unwavering dignity, "I do not deny the facts as presented. I drew my sword in the sacred palace. I spilled blood on ground that should have remained pure. High disturbed ceremonies that honored both our Lord and the Heavenly Emperor." He paused, allowing his words to resonate throughout the hall before continuing in a voice filled with unwavering conviction. "But if I must die for these acts, let me die knowing that I acted according to principles I hold more sacred than any protocol. The defense of honor against corruption, the resistance to injustice, even when such resistance costs one's life. The refusal to allow virtue to be humiliated by vice without consequence, the inevitable sentence. Asano's words fell over the courtroom like stones thrown into a still pond, creating waves of discomfort that spread across the judges' faces. Some lowered their eyes, unable to meet the direct gaze of a man who had chosen principle over prudence. Others hardened their expressions, as if the defendant's unshakable dignity were in itself a further offense to the order they represented. Yanagisawa felt the weight of the moment, with a clarity stemming from decades of serving a regime that depended on absolute obedience to maintain stability. Asano was not just an individual who had broken the law, he was a symbol of resistance, who could inspire others to question established authority. His punishment needed to be not only just according to the law, but exemplary enough to discourage future expressions of defiance. Asano Takumi no Kami, the chief advisor declared, his voice carrying the final weight of imperial authority. Your words reveal a man of conviction, but misguided conviction. The order we protect is not arbitrary tyranny, but the foundation upon which the peace of our nation rests. When individuals choose their own interpretations of justice over established law, the result is chaos. He stood, and everyone in the hall felt the imminent final sentence. For drawing your sword in the sacred palace, for spilling blood on consecrated ground, for violating the most fundamental protocols governing our society, this court sentences you to death by seppuku, to be executed before sunset this very day. The sentence echoed through the hall like a funeral bell, final and irrevocable. But there was a second part that surprised some of those present. Your domain of Ako will be confiscated by the crown. Your vassals will be dispersed. Your samurai will become Ronin. Your lineage will be extinguished from official history. May your death serve as an example that no man, no matter how noble his intentions, is above the laws that hold our society together. It was a punishment that transcended the individual and affected hundreds of innocent families, loyal servants who would lose their position and livelihood because of their lord's actions. It was justice transformed into collective revenge, a lesson that would be paid not only with Asano's life, but with the future of all who had trusted him. Asano received the sentence with the same serenity with which he had faced the trial. He bowed deeply, accepting his fate with a dignity that made some of the judges privately question whether they were truly serving justice or merely political expediency. I accept the judgment of your honored gentleman, he said simply, and I ask only that I be allowed to die as a samurai, with the honor that neither law nor circumstance can take, from a man who remains true to his principles to his last breath. Preparation for eternity. The hours between Asano and his death were devoted to rituals that transformed legal execution into sacred ceremony. Seppuku was not simply suicide, but transcendence through ultimate self-determination, the supreme proof that a warrior could choose the time and manner of his own death, refusing to allow others to control even this most intimate aspect of his existence. The chosen location for the ceremony was a private garden within the palace complex, a space where natural beauty created an atmosphere appropriate for an act that was simultaneously violent and sacred. Cherry blossoms created a canopy of petals that fell like pink snow, each blossom touching the ground, reminding all present of the transitory nature of life and the beauty that could be found even in death. Asano spent his final hours in silent meditation, preparing his mind and spirit for what was to come. He wrote farewell letters to his wife and family, each character of calligraphy expressing a love that transcended physical death. He composed a death poem that captured his final feelings, like cherry blossom, that falls at the perfect moment I choose my own season, preferring honor to duration. When the time came, he was escorted to the garden by officers who had abandoned any pretense of cold formality. There was something about Asano's unwavering dignity that disarmed cynicism and forced the recognition that they were witnessing something genuinely noble, a man facing self-imposed death without hesitation or fear. The tatami mat where he would perform seppuku had been positioned to face east, the direction of the rising sun, and a symbol of spiritual renewal. Nearby, on a lacquered tray, rested the tanto, the short dagger that would perform the final cut. The blade had been polished to a mirror-like shine, and its hilt was wrapped in white paper, allowing it to be held firmly even when wet with blood. Observing the ceremony was a select circle of officers and samurai, men whose presence lent appropriate gravity to the moment. Among them was Kajikawa Yosobei, a veteran designated as Kaishakunin, the attendant responsible for beheading Asano at the appropriate moment, sparing him prolonged agony. The Blade of Liberation. Twilight tinged the garden with hues of gold and crimson as Asano Takumi no Kami knelt on the white tatami mat, assuming the final position that would transform legal punishment into spiritual victory. His clothing, a pristine white kimono over matching hakama, spoke of the spiritual purity that death was about to consecrate. It was a fitting attire for someone who had chosen transcendence over submission. "Let all present know," he said, his clear voice cutting through the reverent silence that had descended upon the garden, "that I die not in shame, but in affirmation of the principles that governed my life. If my actions brought dishonor to our Lord's palace, may my death restore harmony. If my fury disturbed the peace, may my blood purify it." He paused, contemplating for a final moment the beauty of the garden where his earthly life would end. Cherry blossom petals continued to fall around him like tears of the gods, creating a carpet that transformed the ground into an ephemeral work of art. "But let it also be recorded," he continued, his words carrying a weight that would echo through the years to come, "that some principles are worth more than life. Some truths are worth defending, even when such defense costs everything. Let my vassals remember that true honor cannot be conferred by position nor taken away by circumstance. It resides in the souls of men who choose to do right, regardless of the cost." With those words, he took the tanto from the tray, testing its weight and balance with the experience of someone who had wielded blades since childhood. The dagger fit naturally in his hand, as if it had been forged specifically for this moment. The cut, when it came, was executed with a precision that spoke not only of courage, but of perfected technique. Asano had studied seppuku not as a distant possibility, but as an art every samurai should master. The ability to choose honorable death when honorable life became impossible. The blade found its way through flesh with an efficiency that minimized unnecessary suffering. At the appropriate moment, Kajikawa Yosobei executed the final blow with expert precision, his katana releasing Asano from prolonged agony in a single, clean motion. His head rolled forward in a final bow, as if in gratitude for the release. The birth of ghosts. The silence that followed Asano Takumi no Kami's death was broken not by mourning or celebration, but by the sound of men trying to process what they had witnessed. The absolute dignity with which he had faced death had transformed legal execution into spiritual affirmation, creating an unrest that would spread far beyond the palace walls. While officials were busy with the practicalities of clearing the site and preparing the body for a proper burial, messengers were already racing through Edo carrying news that would change the course of Japanese history. Asano's death would be seen not only as a just punishment for a grave crime, but as the martyrdom of an honorable man destroyed by a corrupt system. But it was in the barracks where the Ako samurai awaited news that the true impact of their lord's death began to sink in. Oishi Kuranosuke received the official confirmation with a straight face, but those who knew him well could see the transformation taking place behind his eyes, the metamorphosis from loyal retainer into something far more dangerous. "Our lord is dead," he announced to the circle of warriors who had gathered around him, men whose lives had been redefined in a single moment. He died as a samurai, with honor intact and a clear conscience. Now it is up to us to decide how we will live with this truth. Horikawa Zusho, the fiery young man whose devotion to Asano bordered on worship, was the first to speak. "Then we will follow our lord in death. What value is life without purpose, existence without honor?" But Oishi held up a hand, silencing murmurs of agreement. There was something in his expression that spoke of plans more complex than simple mass suicide. "Death is easy," he said slowly. "Any man can die. But killing requires planning, patience, the sacrifice of everything that made life comfortable. The eyes around the circle widened with dawning understanding. Revenge. Not just abstract justice, but direct personal retribution against the man responsible for the destruction of everything they loved. Kira Yoshinaka lives, Oishi continued, his enemy's name falling from his lips like an ancient curse. He sleeps in his protected mansion, surrounds himself with guards, believes he has escaped the consequences of his actions, but some debts can only be collected in blood. The bloody oath. In the darkness of an abandoned tavern on the outskirts of Edo, 47 men gathered to swear an oath that would transform them, from unemployed samurai into living instruments of divine vengeance. The flickering light of a few candles created dancing shadows that seemed to bless the ceremony with the presence of dead ancestors, warriors from the past, who whispered approval for what was about to happen. Oishi had spent days identifying and contacting only those whose loyalty to Asano transcended practical considerations of personal survival. These were not all of the 300 samurai who had served the Ako domain. Many had families to protect. Others lacked the resolve required for what would be required. But the 47 who answered the call represented the distilled essence of samurai devotion. There were grizzled veterans like Yoshida Chuzaemon, whose loyalty had been tempered by decades of faithful service. Ardent young men like Okano Kinemon, whose entire lives had been defined by admiration for Asano. Middle-aged men like Hara Soman, who had sacrificed employment opportunities with other lords to remain faithful to the memory of their dead master. "Brothers," Oishi said, his voice echoing in the hushed tavern with an authority that transformed speech into sacred ritual, "our presence here tonight marks the end of our old lives and the birth of something new. From this moment on, we exist with only one purpose, to avenge our lord and restore the honor of our house." He unrolled a scroll he had personally prepared, each character written in a calligraphy that spoke of refined education now dedicated to mortal purposes. It was a document that established not only his intentions, but the code that would govern his actions in the months or years it would take to complete his mission. This oath binds us not only to each other, but to the sacred memory of Asano Takumi no Kami. We swear to avenge his death through the blood of Kira Yoshinaka. We swear to sacrifice families, fortunes, futures, everything that might divert us from our goal. And we swear that, when our vengeance is complete, we will follow our Lord in death through collective seppuku. One by one, the 47 men approached the parchment, adding their names in a calligraphy that sealed their fates. There was no hesitation, no second thoughts. These were men who had found a purpose more important than life, a cause more valuable than personal happiness. When the last name was added, Oishi treasured the document. "We are now ghosts," he declared, "dead to the world of the living, born only to fulfill our mission. May the gods help us, for from this night onward, we walk a road that leads only to vengeance and death." The journey begins. When the 47 Ronin left the tavern and dispersed into the darkness of Edo, they carried with them more than just plans for revenge. They carried the transformative weight of a purpose that had completely redefined their identities. They were no longer Oishi Kuranosuke, Horikawa Zusho, Yoshida Chuzaemon, or any of the names they had borne in previous lives. They were instruments of divine justice, extensions of a dead man's will demanding satisfaction. In the months that followed, these men would disappear into the crowds of Edo like ghosts dissolving into mist. Some would become merchants, others artisans, many simply vagabonds, indistinguishable from the tens of thousands of Ronin who roamed Japan without master or apparent purpose. But beneath these worldly masks, they would remain bound together by invisible threads of loyalty and determination that no earthly authority could break. Oishi, as the conspiracy's natural leader, assumed the most elaborate and dangerous disguise. He pretended to become a dissolute drunkard, a man broken by the loss of his position who had turned to sake and prostitutes as an escape from responsibilities he could no longer bear. It was a performance that fooled even some of his own companions, but it allowed him to move freely through Edo while studying Kira Yoshinaka's habits and defenses. Kira himself, initially cautious after Asano's death, gradually relaxed his vigilance as months passed without signs of retribution. He genuinely believed He had escaped the consequences of his actions, that Asano's death had brought the unpleasant episode to a close in a way that would protect his future from unnecessary complications. I was dramatically wrong. In the shadows of Edo, 47 men who had embraced death as their inevitable fate dedicated every waking hour to plotting a revenge that would be remembered for as long as Japan existed. They studied guards, memorized patrols, mapped escape routes. Most importantly, they cultivated the absolute patience that separated planned revenge from impulsive assassination. They knew they had only one chance. They knew that failure would mean not only their own deaths, but the eternal dishonor of their lord. And they knew that success would bring a glorious death that would reunite them with Asano in the world beyond. It was knowledge that sustained their souls through the lonely days of disguise and the sleepless nights of planning. The journey they had begun in that dark tavern would continue through seasons of sacrifice and preparation, culminating in a night of snow and blood that would fulfill all the promises of vengeance. Time was working on their side. Each day, Kira lived in false security only increased the debt that would eventually be paid in full.